Hi, good day. I'm Pieter Jordaan from Seeff Properties in George, and today I have a special guest with me, Des-lie van Wyk from Van Wyk Consultants and Accountants. Des-lie, one of the things that we normally getting asked by our clients is, when a purchaser wants to buy a property is, what kind of structure do I need?
Yeah.
And do I need to buy it in my personal name? Do I need to buy it in a company? Do I need to buy it in a trust? From a tax point of view, what would you say is the different scenarios?
Peter, thanks so much for having me as well. I think it's quite an in-depth conversation that this can get into. That's why I also just brought myself some notes to stick to the points. Otherwise, I'm going to have an hour conversation at the end of the day. But I think there are various structures that can work quite effectively. But I think you really need to do planning in terms of what is your need as a prospective buyer. What do you want to achieve? What is your long-term goals in terms of that? Because if you first need to lay out that foundation in order for you to make a decision.
Absolutely.
And why I'm saying that is just like there's different cost structures to different ways of buying that property. Whether you're buying in your individual capacity, buying it through a company, or buying it through a trust, it all involves cost and administration cost. So you need to determine, do you have a tax saving with this? Is it part of your estate planning? And that is the first step that you need to look at in terms of buying a property and what structure you're going to choose.
No, awesome, Mark. That is absolutely true. But because at the end of the day, is you need to plan ahead. Like you said, it can be a costly change. If I purchase a property in my own name and a few years down the line, I would like to change it over to a trust or a company or whatever the case might be, it can be difficult and it can be expensive.
Yes.
But there is certain ways that is more, I would say, that you can use to actually go into that market of choice and so on. So you need to determine what is my outcome that I would like to reach, because sometimes we see it, if you are a buy-to-let investor, there's different scenarios. Are you one person that would like to buy to rent out and build a pension, or would you like to buy a property and then do renovations and flip it again? And that everything there is going to influence your structures and the way that you are buying the property.
100%. And I love that. And that's why especially if we go into a structure, the first point that I want to touch on is buying in your personal capacity. Because everyone always buys property, and then when they get advice, they're like, you need to do it through a trust, you need to do it through a company. And yes, it's very beneficial to do that. But are you utilizing your primary house first? And that's an important question that you need to ask yourself. Are you buying property to live in it? Or are you buying property to rent it out, or to, like you mentioned, renovate it and then sell it again? But so I would always advise my clients saying, if it's your primary house, buy that in your personal capacity, because there's so much tax benefits that comes with that. I mean, when you buy your primary residence and you sell that after a couple of years, you have a 2 million rand primary exclusion, meaning 2 million rand of profit on that house will be tax-free.
Yeah.
And that's amazing to utilize that kind of benefits.
But if you're in a trust, you don't get that benefit.
Correct.
Or in a PTY.
Yeah, you don't get that benefit.
Yeah.
So your primary exclusion that you get from the South African Revenue Service is only when you have a house in your personal capacity. And what is very important is also that you need to live in it. So you can't utilize your holiday house for your primary residence and utilize your house in Gauteng for primary residence. It's a house that you live in and stay in. So it's very important to determine what house are you using for that. Because the problem is later, if you start renting a specific house out, and say for instance you lived in that house for 5 years or 6 years, and then you start renting that out, SARS will proportionate that 2 million rand primary exclusion that you then have. And it's not anymore the full 2 million. It then gets proportioned.
All right, but say for instance, I've bought this property. It's my only property, but it is in Gauteng.
Yeah.
I want to move to George, and here I rent a property.
Yeah.
is that property still my primary property or not?
So it depends whether somebody is moving into that property.
Yeah, so I rent it out on that side,
So
but
if-
now I'm renting on this side.
So if you
how's
get-
it going to influence my
And I think that's where a lot of people actually get confused, because then they say, but it's still my primary property. And yes, for the time that you lived there, it's 100% still your primary property. But if it's now being rented out, SARS will then look at it in proportion the time that you lived in it as your primary property versus then what you are renting it out for. So even if you're renting in George now, you have your one house in Gauteng and you lived there for 10 years, for instance. Now you're moving to George, you're renting here. It was your primary property. It's still the only property on your name, but now you're renting it out. So immediately it moved over now to a rental property and not your primary property anymore. But you can still utilize a big portion of that, but you need to make sure that you speak to your tax consultants, because it's going to be proportioned.
Okay. Very interesting there.
Yeah.
All right. When it comes to, say, for instance, another scenario that we see is I've inherited this property through deceased estate and so on, and I need to transfer it to my own name. But, at the end of the day, we've got sentimental value about the property. I don't want to get rid of it.
Yeah.
My mind says we're going to utilize this property for the rest of our lives, and our children is going to stay there.
Yeah.
So, going that route, it might sometimes be a good option to buy a property in a trust. Or what is your think about the trust and the way that property is structured into a trust?
And that's a great question, because I think with inheritance, it comes where, and that's why sometimes I say, like, parents and people need to be transparent about who's inheriting the assets. Because what happens is now the person inherits that house in their personal capacity. They don't pay taxes on the inheritance because let's, for instance, say the parents paid estate duty when they passed away. The problem comes in now that the house is in that person's personal capacity. In order to get that house back into a trust, you need to sell it to the trust. Or there's an asset for share transfer, a Section 42, but which becomes very complex when you're doing that. So the ideal would be, if we're specifically speaking about inheritance, is almost to, through your will, already say that your heir will be a family trust and not a person in his personal capacity anymore, because then that transition and the transfer of the property happens once and it moves hands from the deceased to the trust now, and not from the deceased to the individual to the trust, because that involves various different costs, transfer duties again, on both sides around as well. But it is very beneficial to have that property in the trust. So just if I can add on the trust structure, for me it's very important to say, once again, we go back to what is the initial idea and the goal of buying that property, because buying it directly in the trust also has its negatives. When you start renting that property out, the trust is being taxed at 45% fixed rate. So you need to distribute that to your beneficiaries. And if you don't have enough beneficiaries, or your beneficiaries become or gets to a point where they turn 18 and they start working and they start earning their own income, they end up also being on a higher tax bracket. So at the end of the day, the possibility stands there that they will also end up being on a 45% tax bracket in terms of that. So our ideal structure is always having the trust being the shareholder of a company wherein your property is then being bought for rental purposes and investment purposes in terms of that.
So, Des-lie, tell me, if I have a property in my own personal name, and I would like to transfer that property to a trust because I would like my children to inherit it, it's part of my pension, and so on. I believe I can go the route of a Section 42 route, or what we can do there, where the trust is the shareholder of a company and so on. But what costs will be involved in something like that, where I transfer my personal property to a company?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And I think at the end of the day, it's quite a complex situation, so I don't think it's something that we can explain in detail now in this interview what a Section 42 entails. But you will have a lawyer that's involved in terms of creating a contract of a Section 42, because a Section 42 is an agreement essentially in order to transfer your asset for shares in a different company.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, that transaction needs to happen because SARS is allowing capital gains not to immediately take effect, but it's deferred capital gains taxes. So the capital gains will only be paid on a later stadium when the property is actually being disposed of. So just in terms of the specific scenario you mentioned too, if the children want to live in a house and they want to stay in that house forever, it might be more beneficial to just keep it directly in the trust. Okay. But if they want to rent that property out, it will be more beneficial to have it in a company of where the trust is the shareholder of that company.
Okay.
Because then your company is taxed at 27% flat rate, where in the trust you have the 45%. But it is beneficial to move it into the trust structure because then you bypass the estate duty that will be paid on that. And that's essentially why the whole trust structure is there, is for that wealth creation, but also not to pay that 20% for your first 30 million in terms of estate duty, and thereafter you pay 30%.
Okay, so in terms of that, so there's not going to be transfer duty when I transfer a property on a Section 42. There's only going to be the lawyer's cost and so on. My question would be then is if that property is bonded through an institution, would they need to give, I would say, permission to do that? Or is it something that can happen without their knowledge?
So permission will need to be granted, and out of our experience as well, there's a lot of time when restructuring needs to happen and you want to finance a property through a different structure, the bank always needs to start looking at a new feasibility and affordability test. So then they will see, can the company afford it, or can the trust afford to pay that bond? Yes, the trustees or in the trust or the directors of the company will, at the end of the day, be able to stand surety again, and that might work for them. So the bank might not have a problem, but it's definitely a hurdle that they will have to jump over and get permission for first.
So the way that I see it, most of the times, when we sell a property into a company, the bank's looking at about 2 years financial statements. So my thinking is that should you go that route, it's not the short-term process. You need to plan ahead and see that you've already got a company up and running and so on.
Yeah.
My other question would be is if a company is structured for this to accommodate the trust as a shareholder and hold a property in it, but there's no other, I would say, economic business dealings within the company.
Yeah.
Is it still a viable company?
Yeah. And that's exactly, we discussed that before the interview as well, is does the cost justify the transaction? Because in your personal capacity, you have the property, you have transfer duties that you pay, you have your attorney fees, and that's that. End of discussion, right? But now if you register a company, you have your yearly annual returns that you need to submit, you have your beneficial ownership, you need to set up financial statements. So there's a lot of administration cost that's going into it. So you need to quantify and justify whether it's a viable and a feasible transaction for you to go through this whole structure. And that's why you need to have somebody that can advise you properly, where you go and sit down and say, this is my plan and this is what I want to achieve out of this at the end of the day. Because wealth creation is the must that we need to do, and that's perfect to do it through a trust and company structure. But if there's no purpose in terms of that property, or you only have that one property that you're going to buy for the rest of your life, then keep it in your personal capacity, keep it slim, and just limit your risk, right? So limit your risk in what you're doing in your personal capacity, because we have 3.5 million rand in our personal capacity that's excluded from estate duty. So for you, in order to buy property, to have your personal vehicles and everything like that, to get to 3.5 million, it's quite a lot to get to that point. So it might be more beneficial for you then to buy that property in your personal capacity and sort it out there. But I'm guessing when you're 20 or 25 years old and you start acquiring property, you can't really say that it's the only property that you're going to buy for the rest of your life. So then I would almost look at what is my 10-year, 20-year goals in terms of property, and what structure is going to be probably a little bit more costly now, but at the end of the day, it's going to save me quite a lot of money in terms of taxes and estate duty.
I think the main problem, or challenge today is especially with the younger generation, everybody wants instant gratification.
Yeah.
So they want to plan now and they want to reap the benefit tomorrow. But,
Definitely.
when it comes to wealth creation, like you said, it is a long-term process. It's a long-term plan.
Definitely.
And you need to adopt around that. And I think that is why it is very necessary to speak to somebody that has got the knowledge and who can guide you through that process. For me, it is you need to take responsibility
Yes.
for your own wealth and your own outcome at the end of the day. Because it is, I see it a lot of people, they invest every month in a policy or annuity and so on. And it's good practice. But when they go on to pension and when they complain about all the money they've paid over these years and don't receive a benefit of it.
Yeah.
And, but my question would always be, why didn't you take the responsibility for your own life? Because you hand it over to somebody and you ask them to manage it for you. And then you complain. So the main thing there is you always have to have a look and take responsibility, do your homework, chat to people that got knowledge about this kind of stuff and that is interested in helping you acquiring wealth for
100%. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to a godly principle as well of how do you steward what you have. And I think especially for younger people, it's exactly that what you're saying. But, I always have this, I wouldn't say internal conflict in terms of advising to have a retirement annuity versus advising versus property and everything, because there is a beautiful split that you need to have between that. I think when people doesn't have that commitment and that consistency in terms of and discipline to put money aside, it becomes a problem. I sit with clients that's 45 years old, 50 years old, haven't saved a single cent. They have nothing left for retirement. So for those people, you almost advise them, start just putting 500 Rand away a month into a retirement annuity. Because for those kind of people that struggle to look at a bigger picture and to have that discipline in order to put money aside, that kind of investment is a good way and a good route to go. But with property, if I can have my own property portfolio at the end of the day, I would be so glad in terms of that, because I see, especially in the market here in the Garden Region, you can touch more on that in terms of how the market is currently doing. But it's really something where you get growth out of your property, you get a return on investment of your property. So it's good. It's just you need to play the long-term game in terms of that as well, and not be overly excited if you see your property grew 100,000 in 3 years time and then sell it, but then just keep on being persistent in terms of what that goal is at the end of the day.
No, absolutely. I think that if you really have a look at it with property is that first of all you've got the capital gain side, that it gains in capital, but then you also have income in terms of rental.
Yes.
So there's one or other time that the rental is going to meet the bond payment that you are doing, and then you actually, get a surplus on that, and then you need to decide, are you going to take that surplus and put it back into the bond, so it's going to decrease the bond period, or are you going to utilize that money for something else? But in the meantime, it's still growing. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you need to plan maintenance within that structure, because we see it a lot, that people will buy a property for rental, but they don't feed the horses. And then, they can't understand, why, you can't get a good tenant and why the scenarios and so on. So the main thing is it's all about that maintenance.
So definitely.
My question to you now would be, when would it be the right time to buy a property in terms of your background?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you need to look at your financial appetite. What can you afford and what can't you afford? I think in terms of the right time for structure, if I can quickly touch on that, is if you end up choosing a route for a trust as a shareholder of a company, buy your property immediately through the company. Because a lot of people buy the property, like we said, now they have it in a personal capacity, then they have to transfer it to the company, it becomes costly. If you can stand surety in your personal capacity for that company as the director, and you can start acquiring the property through the company, that's the ideal start to get this portfolio sorted. I think in terms of the right time for the market, that's something you're going to have to touch on. The right time to start investing for young people and for any kind of person is to start right now. They say today is already too late. You had to start yesterday already.
Absolutely.
And I think that's important. So I want to encourage younger people that has the financial capacity to start buying property now, to do it now, to speak to Seeff and find good property that's going to end up bring a good return on investment for you, so that you can start building towards that financial freedom, which we all are striving for. And I'm always say, like, people are saying, I'm striving to financial freedom, and then they're 45 years old and I'm saying, okay, what do you have? No, I have nothing. And I'm like, it's a little bit late, but you can still get there. But just start now. So if you have an appetite for property and you're happy to get tenants into your property, you're happy to do property development and everything, and you have the appetite for that, start right now. But I think you can maybe touch on, like, how is the market currently doing? I think for the listeners and our clients that we're going to send this to as well is, how is the market of George in terms of property?
Well, currently the market is very buoyant because if you really have a look at this, I think everybody that is staying up north would like to come and stay in the garden route. It is actually everything is working, everything is moving, and so on. But at the end of the day, is like you said, for us, is when it is the best time to purchase a property, it is now. Because we've got a lot of clients and say, but this is a balloon, the prices is too high, this is a balloon. There's no way that the prices is too high currently. What we need to understand is, when it comes to property and land, there's no more land manufactured. So, and more people is created. So at the end of the day, is land is only going to become smaller, more valuable, and so on. So the main thing is that at the end of the day, is property is only going to grow. If you have I once had a look at the graph of the last 60 years, and if you have a look at that graph, it's property not going up in a straight line, it's going up in steps, and a lot of people think, we're going to go into a bubble now, it's going to burst. There's no such thing. The main thing is people need to have a roof over their heads. They need to accumulate property, and that is the best way to actually take, to enhance your benefit at the end of the day, and wealth creation. But like we asked in the beginning, when is the best time? In my opinion, that's always now. But the main thing is you need to go and have a look at affordability. You need to go and have a look at your what is the banks going to look at, what is available, because it's not going to become cheaper. It's definitely growing value. So and you need to take that into consideration with your salary, or you need to, like you say, put a certain amount away that you can build up deposit. Stuff like that. But Des-lie, thank you very much. I think it was very informative, and our clients would appreciate more value. If you need any more assistance, contact with Des-lie. His details will be in the video, and then he will assist you with clarification on the best structure to purchase your property in. And when you are ready to buy a property, now's the right time. Make contact with us and we will assist you from that side. But Des-lie, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pieter.
Have a lovely day.
Cheers.